Catherine of Aragon. In 1485, the Mediterranean was a theatre of shifting power and rising empires. In the Iberian Peninsula, two kingdoms, Aragon and Castile, were moving toward a union that would change the course of history. This was the dawn of the Spanish superpower, a political force forged by the strategic marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella. Their union was not merely romantic, it was a calculated masterstroke of statecraft. As they consolidated their control, they laid the foundations for an empire that would eventually dominate much of the known world. At the center of this burgeoning power was a child born into a world of high-stakes diplomacy, a princess whose very existence was a tool for international influence. The shadow of her mother, Isabella of Castile, loomed large over Catherine's early years. Isabella was no mere consort, she was a formidable military leader and a decisive sovereign. She did not simply witness the formation of her kingdom, she fought for it, leading troops into battle to secure her throne against rival claimants. There is a certain ferocity to the history of Castile, a civil war that defined the era. Isabella was a woman who could rally an army and personally lead a charge, all while maintaining a deeply pious and reform-minded court. This legacy of resilience, this capacity to wield authority in a world of men, would become the bedrock of Catherine's own character.
Isabella was, in many ways, the more important member of that duo.
While Isabella was the sword of Castile, Ferdinand of Aragon was the architect of its diplomacy. Together, they navigated a landscape of constant conflict, particularly with the ambitions of France. The French were the traditional enemy of the English, and they were also a direct threat to Ferdinand's interests in Italy, specifically in Naples and Sicily. To counter this, the Spanish monarchs began weaving a complex web of marriage alliances. They sought to isolate France by binding their children to the great houses of Europe, including Portugal and the Habsburg Empire. It was a strategy of containment, ensuring that no single power could dominate the continent without facing a unified Spanish response. In 1489, one of these vital pieces was set in motion, a marriage alliance with England. The goal was to strengthen both the Tudor and the Spanish dynasties, which were both still relatively new and vulnerable following internal conflicts like the Wars of the Roses. For Catherine, this meant an engagement at the age of only 3 years old. It was a standard practice for royal houses, a way to secure future peace through bloodlines. This betrothal was intended for the heir to the English crown, Prince Arthur. It was a high-stakes gamble, a move to bring the burgeoning Spanish superpower into the orbit of the English throne. Catherine was not prepared for a life of idle ceremony, she was trained for a life of intellectual and political combat. Her education was a rigorous humanist curriculum, designed to make her a capable diplomat and ruler. She did not merely learn the social graces of a princess, she mastered the tools of statecraft. Under the tutelage of an Italian humanist, Alessandro Geraldini, she studied law and history. She mastered arithmetic and became proficient in multiple languages. She spoke her native Castilian and French, learned Latin from a dedicated tutor, and even acquired a grasp of Greek. This was a sophisticated, modern education that placed her among the most learned women of her age. This academic depth was not for vanity, it was for utility. A princess in the 16th century was often an ambassador in all but name, and Catherine's training ensured she could hold her own in any court. She was being groomed to manage the complex intersection of Spanish and English interests. Her ability to navigate law and history would prove essential when she later had to defend her own legitimacy and her children's rights. The intellectual strength she developed in the halls of the Spanish court would become her most potent weapon when she eventually stood alone in a foreign land. She was born to greatness, with her parents ruling most of Spain, and her siblings marrying into the great royal families of Europe. The sheer scale of Catherine's connections was staggering. Her siblings were being married off to the most powerful dynasties in Europe, from Portugal to the Habsburgs. This was not just a family, it was a geopolitical network that spanned the continent. When she finally arrived in London at the age of 15, she did not come merely as a bride, but as the physical embodiment of this massive, interconnected web of power. She brought with her a retinue of magnificent Spanish fashion, including heavily pleated gowns and wide skirts held out with cane. To the English court, she was something exotic, something splendid, and something profoundly significant. Her arrival was a spectacle designed to showcase the wealth and prestige of her parents. The City of London greeted her with pageants and formal processions, a visual demonstration of the weight of the Spanish alliance. This was the culmination of a decade of planning, a moment where the interests of the Tudors and the Spanish monarchs finally met in a single person. At 15, she was no longer just a daughter of Spain, she was the future of the English succession. She stepped into a role that would demand everything from her, carrying the weight of a superpower on her shoulders. Yet, this arrival was fraught with tension from the very start. The marriage was not just about union, it was about the control of dowries and the legitimization of dynasties. As the young princess prepared to meet her husband, Arthur, she was stepping into a game where the rules were constantly being rewritten by men in distant courts. The stability she represented was a thin veneer over a world of intense political maneuvering. Her life would be defined by this struggle, the attempt to maintain the dignity of her Spanish blood while navigating the volatile, often treacherous, politics of the Tudor court. The year is 1501, and the air in London is thick with the tension of a massive diplomatic arrival. A 15-year-old princess, Catherine of Aragon, arrives with a retinue of such magnificence that it leaves the English court astonished. She is the daughter of the rising Spanish superpower, the child of Ferdinand and Isabella. Her arrival is not merely a social event, it is a carefully orchestrated display of Spanish might designed to isolate France. The London crowds gather in feverish excitement to witness this exotic figure, the personification of a vital alliance. She moves through the city amidst a flurry of pageantry, her presence a symbol of the continuity of the Tudor dynasty. The fashion Catherine brings with her is as striking as her lineage. The English eye, accustomed to more understated silhouettes, is caught off guard by the dramatic Spanish style. She wears gowns with voluminous, heavily pleated sleeves and a skirt held out by bands of cane, a precursor to the fardingale. Her hair is dressed in a distinct manner, often paired with a structured hood that marks her as someone profoundly different from the ladies of the English court. This visual distinction serves a purpose, it is a constant, walking reminder of the prestige and the specific cultural weight of the Spanish crown that she carries into the Tudor household. The union was intended to be with Arthur, the Prince of Wales and heir to the Tudor throne. But the high stakes of European diplomacy often collided with the fragile reality of human life. Within just 5 months of their wedding, the marriage is cut short by death. At only 16 years old, Catherine is transformed from a bride into a widow. She finds herself in a precarious, almost invisible position, the Dowager Princess of Wales, yet a woman without a clear function in the English court. The suddenness of her loss leaves her in a state of political and personal limbo. This widowhood ignites a fierce financial war between Henry VII and Ferdinand of Aragon. The dispute centers on the massive dowry Catherine brought with her. Henry VII demands the full payment of the dowry, viewing it as his due, perhaps even as a way to exert control over the Spanish interests. Ferdinand, however, is unyielding. He argues that because the marriage to Arthur was never consummated, Catherine should retain control over her funds. This disagreement leaves Catherine trapped in a cycle of scarcity and resentment. She writes home to her father, complaining of the lack of proper clothing and the inability to pay her servants. The financial struggle is not merely about gold, it is about the very dignity of a princess. Catherine's letters reveal a woman pushed to her limits by what she perceives as the stinginess of the English crown. She finds herself forced to sell her own jewelry just to afford the fabric required for new gowns. She laments the lack of fine linen for underclothing, a necessity for any woman of her status. The king's refusal to provide her with sufficient property or a proper income means she must essentially self-fund her own royal appearance. This struggle for resources becomes a primary tool of political leverage used by Henry VII to keep her within his orbit. As Catherine navigates this period of uncertainty, she begins to assert herself in ways that surprise the court. She is not a passive observer of her own misfortune, she is a woman of formidable training and intellect. Having been educated in law, history, and multiple languages, she possesses a political sophistication far beyond her years. She becomes so outspoken and effective that Ferdinand officially names her his ambassador in England. This makes her one of the first official female ambassadors in European history. She is no longer just a pawn to be moved, she is a representative of a superpower, capable of communicating directly with her father. The legal crux of her future revolves around a question of intimacy and the validity of her first union. Catherine herself maintains a lifelong, unwavering stance. She shared a bed with Arthur for only 7 nights. She insists she remained a maiden until her marriage to Henry VIII. This claim would later become the central battlefield for her entire queenship. If the marriage was never consummated, the legality of her subsequent union with the new king becomes a matter of intense theological and legal debate. It is a question that pits the interpretation of Scripture against the established decrees of the papacy. When Henry VIII ascends the throne, the landscape shifts once more. The man who was once her brother-in-law becomes her king, and the prospect of a marriage between them becomes a political necessity. This is not just a personal union, but a strategic pivot to solidify the Tudor-Spanish alliance. Catherine moves from the status of a widow-in-waiting to the intended bride of the future king. The transition is complex. She is a woman who has already known the weight of marriage and the grief of loss, now stepping into the most high-profile role in Europe. The young, exuberant Henry sees her not just as a wife, but as a source of prestige and legitimacy. In the early years, the marriage appears to be a success of both politics and affection. Henry seems to adore her, going beyond courtly conventions to demonstrate his devotion. He jousts in her colors, wearing her favors, a gesture that breaks with the standard etiquette where a wife is not usually the object of such public displays. They appear to be a sweet, vibrant couple, participating in the lavish masques and dances of the Tudor court. For a time, the alliance between England and Spain is secured by this union, providing a sense of stability to a dynasty that had been recently ravaged by civil war. However, the shadow of the succession looms over their happiness. The primary goal of the marriage was to produce a male heir to secure the Tudor line. While they would eventually have Princess Mary in 1516, the lack of a surviving son becomes a growing source of anxiety for the king. This biological reality, combined with the age difference between the couple, begins to fuel doubts about the religious and legal viability of their match. The stability of the alliance is increasingly threatened by the very thing it was meant to ensure: a clear, undisputed succession for the English throne.
I think Catherine was a deeply religious woman. And I don't think she would have perjured herself even to save her queenship.
You're not treating me like a father should treat his daughter, and especially a daughter of Spain.
As the years pass, the woman who arrived as a 15-year-old princess has become a seasoned political actor. The widow of Wales has transitioned into the Queen of England, but the struggles for dignity and status remain. She has survived the loss of a husband, the cruelty of a father-in-law, and the complexities of a shifting European order. Her identity is no longer just that of a Spanish infanta, but a woman who has carved out a space of authority through sheer resilience. The stage is set for the great conflict that will define her life and the future of the English Church. The rise of a queen. In 1489, a political masterstroke was set in motion to reshape the map of Europe. The marriage alliance between England and Spain was designed for a single, massive purpose: the isolation of France. For the Tudor dynasty, still recovering from the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, an alliance with the burgeoning Spanish superpower offered much-needed stability. For Ferdinand and Isabella, the monarchs who laid the foundations of a united Spain, it was another piece in their ambitious global strategy. At the center of this high-stakes game was a young princess, a child of the most formidable parents in Christendom. Catherine was born into a world of immense power in 1485. Her father, Ferdinand, was the King of Aragon, and her mother, Isabella, was the Queen of Castile. She was born to greatness, with her parents ruling most of Spain, and her siblings marrying into the great royal families of Europe. This was not merely a matter of wealth, but of raw, transformative political force. Her mother, Isabella, was a particularly extraordinary figure, a military campaigner who could rally troops and lead them onto the battlefield herself. Catherine was raised in the shadow of this resilience, prepared to navigate a continent where bloodlines were the ultimate currency. To ensure Catherine could hold her own in the courts of Europe, she received an education that was remarkably advanced for the period. Under the tutelage of humanist scholars like the Italian Alessandro Geraldini, she moved far beyond the traditional domestic training of a princess. She mastered law, history, and arithmetic. Her linguistic skills were equally formidable. She spoke her native Castilian, learned French, mastered Latin, and possessed a working knowledge of Greek. This was a humanist education designed to create a leader, a woman capable of engaging with the most sophisticated minds of the Renaissance. When the 15-year-old princess arrived in London for her wedding to Arthur, the heir to the Tudor crown, she was a spectacle of foreign magnificence. Her arrival was a carefully choreographed display of Spanish prestige. The London crowds were captivated by her retinue and the exotic, opulent fashion she brought with her. Spanish style was a shock to English eyes. Her gowns featured heavily pleated, voluminous sleeves and massive skirts held out by bands of cane, known as the fardingale. She was a living symbol of the might of Ferdinand and Isabella, a striking, sophisticated presence in a court that was still relatively raw and young. The marriage was supposed to be the foundation of a new era, but tragedy struck almost immediately. Only 5 months after the wedding, Arthur died. At 16, Catherine was a widow, left in a state of profound political and financial limbo. She was the Dowager Princess of Wales, yet she held no real function in the English court. A fierce dispute erupted between Henry VII and Ferdinand over her dowry. Henry demanded the money be paid in full, while Ferdinand argued that because the marriage had never been consummated, Catherine should retain control of the funds. This dispute would cast a long, bitter shadow over her future. During these years of uncertainty, Catherine's personality began to harden into something formidable and self-assertive. She found herself caught in the orbit of her father-in-law, Henry VII, who sought to control her movements and her finances. She grew increasingly vocal about her lack of status and resources, complaining bitterly about the lack of proper clothing and the inability to pay her servants. She felt she was being treated poorly, not as an infanta of Spain, but as a dependent of the English crown. In her letters to her father, she was blunt and unapologetic, rebuking him for his perceived failure to protect her dignity. Her agency was so pronounced that Ferdinand eventually took the extraordinary step of naming her his official ambassador in England. This made her one of the first official female ambassadors in European history. She was no longer just a pawn waiting for her next move, she was a diplomat in her own right. She navigated the complexities of the English court with a sharp, sometimes sarcastic, intelligence. She was a woman who understood that in the game of kings, visibility was a form of power, and she refused to be sidelined by the men who sought to manage her. When Henry VIII ascended the throne, the dynamic shifted from survival to spectacular romance. The young king was exuberant, athletic, and clearly enamored with his new bride. He went beyond the standard courtly conventions to show his affection, often jousting in her colors and wearing her favors. In the early years, they appeared as a remarkably sweet and affectionate couple. For Henry, she was a source of glamour and sophistication that bolstered the prestige of his young dynasty. For Catherine, the marriage offered a chance to finally fulfill the grand political purpose for which she had been raised. By 1513, Catherine had moved from being a consort to a vital pillar of the state. While Henry VIII was campaigning in France to pursue his dreams of military glory, he left Catherine in charge of the realm. He appointed her as Governor and Captain General of England, a testament to the immense trust he placed in her ability to maintain order. She was not merely a placeholder, she was a political actor who managed the complex machinery of the English government during a period of international conflict. This was the height of her authority, a moment when she proved she could govern as effectively as any king. As the war with the Scots intensified, Catherine's management proved crucial to the English war effort. While Henry was focused on France, she took charge of the logistics for the northern campaigns. From her base in Warwick, she organized the procurement of armor and the supply of essential goods for the armies. She was even heavily pregnant during this period, yet she remained intensely involved in the war's progress. When news arrived of the decisive victory at the Battle of Flodden, she sent Henry a blooded coat from the Scottish king, James IV, as a grim, martial trophy. It was a gesture that combined feminine domesticity with the harsh realities of medieval warfare. Catherine's political identity was a constant negotiation between her English role and her Spanish blood. She was a master of visual politics, using her clothing to signal her allegiances. While she largely adopted the English style of dress to fit in at court, she strategically reverted to Spanish fashion for major diplomatic encounters, such as the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520. At that summit, surrounded by the French court, she stood as a singular beacon of Spanish interest. She understood that every gown and every jewel was a tool of statecraft, a way to assert her status and her lineage in a world where appearance was everything. Yet, beneath the splendor of the queenly persona, the cracks were beginning to show. The birth of Princess Mary in 1516 had provided a hope for the dynasty, but it had also highlighted the central problem for Henry, the lack of a male heir. As the years passed, the exuberant young king began to look elsewhere, and the religious and legal foundations of his marriage were called into question. The very alliance that had brought her to England was becoming a source of friction, as Catherine's identity as an agent of Spain began to clash with Henry's shifting political needs. The queen who had once governed a kingdom was now entering the most dangerous struggle of her life. The great matter. The stability of the Tudor dynasty rested upon a single, biological certainty, the production of a male heir. For years, the marriage between Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon had been viewed as a successful cornerstone of the Anglo-Spanish alliance, a union that had brought prestige and political security to the realm. However, the shadow of the Wars of the Roses loomed large in the English psyche, leaving a deep-seated anxiety regarding any potential succession crisis. By the mid-1510s, this anxiety began to morph into a singular, obsessive preoccupation for the king. The birth of Princess Mary in 1516, while a triumph for Catherine personally, failed to resolve the fundamental problem facing the crown. She was the only healthy child of the union to survive to adulthood, but she was a daughter, and in the eyes of a king desperate to secure his line, she was not the answer. Henry's search for a theological justification to dissolve his marriage was both calculated and selective. He turned his gaze toward the Book of Leviticus, arguing that because his predecessor, Arthur, had been married to Catherine, the union between Henry and his brother's widow was a violation of divine law. The king's argument rested on the premise that the marriage was cursed by God, effectively rendering their children illegitimate. Yet, this was a highly convenient reading of Scripture. While Henry focused his arguments on the prohibitions found in Leviticus, he pointedly ignored the contradictory guidance found in the book of Deuteronomy. This was not a search for truth, but a search for a loophole, a way to navigate the complex intersection of theology and the king's personal desire for a new, younger wife. The legal reality of the marriage stood in direct opposition to the king's theological claims. Long before Henry VIII ever considered an annulment, a papal dispensation had been granted to allow the marriage to take place, regardless of whether Catherine's first marriage to Arthur had been consummated. This dispensation was considered double-binding. It had addressed the legality of the union from the very beginning. For Catherine, the matter was not a matter of divine mystery or shifting interpretation, but of established canon law. If the Pope had sanctioned the union, then the union was valid, and any subsequent claim to its illegitimacy was a direct assault on the authority of the Church itself. This legal distinction would eventually become the primary battlefield in a war that would split the English Church from Rome. As the political pressure intensified, Henry's accusations grew increasingly personal and inflammatory. By the summer of 1531, the king made a staggering claim. He asserted that he had not slept with Catherine for 7 years. This was a calculated attempt to undermine the validity of their marriage and, by extension, the legitimacy of their daughter, Mary. It was an appalling accusation for a woman who had stood by her husband through years of political upheaval and the shared joys of motherhood. This period marked a watershed moment in their relationship, as the uneasy coexistence that had defined their recent years vanished, replaced by a profound and public estrangement that would leave Catherine isolated from the court she had once helped rule. In the face of this systematic dismantling of her marriage and her reputation, Catherine refused to surrender her identity. The king attempted to strip her of her dignity by forcing the title of Princess Dowager upon her, a move designed to demote her from the status of a sovereign queen to that of a mere widow. Catherine's response was a fierce, unwavering refusal. She insisted on being addressed as queen, maintaining that her status was not a gift from Henry that could be revoked, but a right established by her marriage and her royal blood. This was not merely a matter of pride, it was a political necessity to ensure that her daughter, Mary, could still claim the throne. To accept the lower title was to concede that her marriage was invalid, and with it, her daughter's right to rule.
She fought for her dignity, but more importantly, she fought for the legitimacy of her daughter. She knew that if she conceded her status as queen, she was effectively disinheriting Mary.
The conflict took on a desperate, almost claustrophobic quality as Catherine was moved between various remote manor houses. These locations were chosen specifically to prevent her from becoming a focal point for popular support or a rallying cry for those sympathetic to her cause. Even in her isolation, she maintained a sense of regal purpose, engaging with the most prominent intellectual minds of Europe to support her legal and theological position. Her struggle was a lonely one, conducted through letters and legal briefs, but it was underpinned by a profound sense of duty to her lineage and her faith. She remained a queen in her own mind and in the eyes of many, even as the machinery of the Tudor state worked tirelessly to erase her from the official record. In her final years, Catherine's letters to Henry revealed a woman who had managed to separate her personal suffering from her royal obligations. Even as the king moved toward a complete break with the Catholic Church, Catherine remained steadfast in her devotion, seeing the king's actions as a betrayal of the very soul he was tasked to protect. Her final words to him were a striking mixture of a wife's affection and a queen's admonition, a delicate balance of love and steel. She died in 1536, having endured 2 decades of a marriage that had transformed from a celebrated alliance into a bitter, theological, and personal battlefield. Her legacy, however, would be carried forward by the daughter she had fought so relentlessly to legitimize. The struggle of Catherine of Aragon was never just about a single woman or a single marriage, it was a collision between the old order of Europe and the emerging sovereignty of the English nation. Her insistence on her status as queen was a defiant stand against the tide of political expediency and religious upheaval. Through her resilience, she ensured that the question of her legitimacy would remain a central, unresolved tension in English history for generations to come. She had been born to greatness, and she died defending the very essence of that greatness, even when the world she knew had been irrevocably changed. By the mid-1530s, the woman who had once been the glittering symbol of a Spanish-Tudor alliance was a shadow of her former self. The grand processions and the heavy, opulent Spanish fashions that had once captivated the streets of London were replaced by a quiet, forced isolation. As Henry VIII turned his gaze toward Anne Boleyn and a new political alignment with France, Catherine was systematically removed from the center of power. To prevent her from becoming a focal point for popular uprisings or a rallying cry for those loyal to the old ways, the king relegated her to various remote manor houses. She was moved from one secluded house to another, a prisoner in her own kingdom, stripped of the dignity that her lineage and her 20 years of service demanded. This was not merely a political sidelining, it was a calculated attempt to erase her status. Henry VIII attempted to force the title of Princess Dowager upon her, a designation that would imply her marriage to Arthur had been her only true claim to royal standing. Catherine, however, remained unyielding. She refused to accept any title other than queen, maintaining that her marriage to Henry was valid and eternal. Even in her seclusion, she was a woman of profound intellect and legal resolve, engaging with the finest minds of Europe to assert her rights. She did not merely wait for her fate, she actively fought a battle of pamphlets, theological arguments, and diplomatic correspondence to defend her legitimacy. The legal battle was as much about the soul as it was about the crown. Henry VIII had begun to frame his desire for an annulment as a religious necessity, citing the Book of Leviticus to argue that his marriage to his brother's widow was an abomination in the eyes of God. It was a selective reading of Scripture, conveniently ignoring the Book of Deuteronomy, which appeared to support his union. Catherine's response was a masterclass in intellectual and spiritual defiance. She did not just argue the law, she argued the sanctity of her vows and the authority of the papacy that had sanctioned her marriage. For Catherine, to admit the marriage was invalid was to commit perjury against her own soul and the God she served.
I think I trust Catherine. I think Catherine was a deeply religious woman. And I don't think she would have perjured herself even to save her queenship.
The personal toll of this protracted struggle was immense. This was a woman who had spent 2 decades building a life, a family, and a reputation as a queen. The king's recent claims were a direct assault on her very existence and her motherhood. In 1531, Henry had gone so far as to claim he had not slept with her for 7 years, effectively branding all her children as illegitimate. The psychological weight of being told that your life's work and your children's very identity were based on a lie is almost inconceivable. It was a systematic attempt to deconstruct the woman she had become through decades of service and motherhood.
I have been your wife for 20 years. I have had all these children. How can you possibly say I'm not your wife?
Despite the cruelty of her husband and the isolation of her surroundings, Catherine's final correspondence to Henry was remarkably devoid of the bitterness one might expect. In a letter written as her strength failed, she expressed a profound, almost spiritual, affection that stunned her contemporaries. She did not write as a discarded wife, but as a loyal, suffering queen, urging him to protect his soul and, crucially, to look after their daughter, Mary. It was a final act of political and maternal strategy, ensuring that even in her death, her influence and her concern for her child's future remained part of the royal conversation. Her words were a bridge between the woman she was and the legacy she was leaving behind.
Mine eyes desire, above all, to see you.
In 1536, after 20 years of marriage, the era of Catherine of Aragon came to an end. She died in relative isolation, far from the splendor of the court she had once governed as regent. Her death marked the definitive break between England and the established order of Europe, as the king's pursuit of a male heir led to a total religious and political schism. The woman who had been born to greatness, a princess of the Spanish superpower, died as a woman who had refused to yield her dignity even when her crown was being torn away. Her passing was the closing of a chapter in the history of the Tudor dynasty, a period defined by the high-stakes diplomacy of her parents. Yet, Catherine's story did not end with her final breath, it lived on through the bloodline she fought so fiercely to protect. Her daughter, Mary, would eventually ascend to the throne as Queen Mary I, a woman who mirrored her mother's absolute determination and religious devotion. Mary's reign was a powerful vindication of Catherine's struggle. In her first parliament, Mary's government formally declared that the marriage of her parents had been valid from the very beginning. The law was so deeply embedded that it was never repealed, even by her successor, Elizabeth I. Through Mary, Catherine's defiance was codified into English law, ensuring her legacy was not just a memory, but a permanent part of the realm's history. Catherine's ultimate legacy is found in the endurance of her bloodline and the precedent she set for royal women. She was the first of Henry's wives to be a queen by birth, not merely by marriage, and she established a standard of conduct and political agency that subsequent queens would both emulate and struggle against. While she is often remembered as the first wife in a list of 6, history views her as the foundation of the Tudor queenhood. She was a woman who navigated the most dangerous waters of European politics, surviving the death of a husband, the loss of children, and the betrayal of a king, only to be remembered as the mother of a queen.